The sun was a hammer on the cracked alkali flat outside Yuma. William Money didn't dare look back. He could feel the hoofbeats through the soles of his worn-out boots, a faint, rhythmic tremor that was growing stronger. Thirst was a blade in his throat, and the air he dragged into his burning lungs was as hot as a furnace blast. He clutched the worn leather satchel tighter to his chest, its weight a familiar burden and the sole reason for the chase. His own heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, loud enough, he feared, for them to hear. A glance at the horizon confirmed his terror. The shimmering heat was no longer empty. A small dark cloud of dust had bloomed against the piercing blue sky, a smudge of doom that grew with every passing second. It wasn't a mirage. It was judgment, riding hard and fast. He stumbled, catching himself on a shard of rock, his knuckles bleeding into the pale dirt. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let them take it back. He couldn't let them take him. Forcing his legs into a staggering run, he fixed his eyes on the distant, hazy outline of the mountains, a sanctuary that seemed a lifetime away. The world dissolved into a shimmering blur. William Money fell, not with a stumble, but with the dead-weight finality of a man whose legs had given their last command. The alkali dust, fine as flour, puffed up around his face, caking his lips and stinging his eyes. The satchel landed beside him with a soft thud. He lay there, listening to the drumbeat of the hooves, no longer a tremor in the ground, but a distinct, approaching thunder. This was it. This was the end of the line. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, his muscles screaming. Just ahead, nestled in a shallow depression he hadn't seen before, was a wreck. A prairie schooner, its canvas ripped to shreds, sat tilted at a drunken angle, one of its heavy wheels shattered. A horse lay dead in its harness, swarming with flies. But another one, a scrawny bay, stood tethered to the wreckage, its head hung low in weary resignation, and slumped in the sliver of shade cast by the broken wagon was a figure. Money crawled closer, his pistol drawn. It was a woman, her dress torn and filmed with dust. Her head was bowed, but as he approached, it snapped up. Her eyes were sharp, defiant, set in a face of grim determination. In her lap rested an old shotgun. "They'll be on you in 5 minutes," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. She didn't ask who. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the dust cloud he had just outrun. "Axle's broke. The other horse is gone." Her voice was surprisingly steady. He saw it then. The choice, laid bare under the merciless sun. He could take her horse. It looked half dead, but it was better than his own 2 feet. He could take her water, if she had any left. He could leave her to face the riders and buy himself another hour, maybe 2. It was the smart play. It was the only play. He looked from her face, etched with a fatigue that mirrored his own, to the approaching riders, now distinct figures on the horizon. He saw the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. Running was over. There was no more ground to gain. With a groan, he pulled himself to his feet. He walked to the scrawny bay, untied its reins, and led it behind the wagon, pressing its flank to force it to lie down. It complied with a weary sigh. He unslung his own rifle from his shoulder and checked the action. He looked at the woman, whose eyes had followed his every move. "Stay behind the wheel," he ordered, his voice finding a sliver of its old authority. He laid the leather satchel beside her. "Don't you let him take that." He knelt behind the dead horse, resting the barrel of his rifle on the stiffened carcass. He was no longer running. He had made his stand on this godforsaken patch of dirt for a stranger with a shotgun and a satchel full of trouble. The world that was about escape had just collapsed into a space no bigger than a single wagon, and the only way out was through the men bearing down on them. The woman's eyes, the color of faded denim, held his for a moment longer. There was no gratitude in them, only a cold, hard assessment. She gave a short, sharp nod, then shifted her weight behind the broken wagon wheel, the heavy gauge of the shotgun resting steady across her lap. She didn't waste motion. Every movement was efficient, born of a life that didn't allow for wasted effort. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the heat, broken only by the angry buzz of flies feasting on the dead horse and the soft creak of sun-baked wood. Money settled himself behind the stiffened carcass, the smell of dust and decay filling his nostrils. He could make out the riders more clearly now. 4 of them. They'd fanned out slightly, confident. He rested his cheek against the warm stock of his rifle, the familiar weight, a small comfort. "How many you count?" Her voice was low, without a tremor. It carried just enough to cut through the oppressive quiet. 4, he answered, not taking his eyes from the shimmering horizon. One of 'em's Augustus, rides a big roan. He'll be the one talking. She didn't ask who Augustus was. The name was enough. And the satchel? He spared it a glance. It lay in the dirt by her knee, a simple leather bag that had caused a world of trouble. What's in it is mine. They think it's theirs. That seemed to be all the explanation she needed. She worked the action on her shotgun, the solid chunk of the mechanism a definitive sound in the dead air. From a small pouch at her waist, she pulled 2 more shells, brass glinting in the sun, and placed them on the wagon hub beside her. Ready. Money felt a strange calm settle over him. The panic of the chase had burned away, leaving only this stark, simple reality. There was no more ground to run, no more choices to weigh. There was only this patch of scorched earth, this broken wagon, and this woman whose name he didn't know. He watched the riders draw closer, their figures wavering in the heat like specters. He could feel the thirst clawing at the back of his throat, a dry fire that made it hard to swallow. As if reading his mind, she nudged something toward him with the toe of her worn boot, a canteen, dented and dark with moisture. "There's not much," she said, "but you'll shoot straighter with a wet throat." He looked from the canteen to her face. It was an offering, but also a command, an investment. She wasn't saving a man, she was sharpening a weapon. He reached out, his hand gritty with dirt, and took it. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most welcome thing he'd ever felt. He took a short pull, just enough to quell the fire, and slid it back to her. His gaze lingered on her hands. They weren't soft. The knuckles were scraped, the nails broken. They were hands that knew work and hardship. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice less of a rasp now. She followed his gaze to the wreckage of her life. "Was headed for Santa Fe. My brother's there. Or was." She looked back at the riders, her expression unreadable. "Axel gave out 2 nights ago. Ben, my horse, he bolted during the night. Guess he had more sense than me." Money understood that. The urge to bolt was a powerful thing. He thought of his own mad flight across the flat. He looked down at his own hands, steadying the rifle. He saw a faint tremor in his left thumb and clenched his fist to still it. He wasn't as young as he used to be. The fear was still there, hiding just beneath the calm. It was an old friend. "You don't seem the type to give up easy," he observed, his eyes still fixed on the approaching threat. A dry, mirthless smile touched her lips for a fraction of a second. "My name is Matty Ross. Giving up ain't in my blood. Foolishness, maybe, but not giving up. William Money." He almost said his own name but stopped. Names were for people with futures. Right now, he was just the man with the rifle. "That satchel," Matty said, her tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "For them to chase a man to the very edge of hell, it must hold something worth more than gold." Money's gaze fell to the bag. He could feel its contents in his mind, the weight and texture of the papers inside. He saw a wind-swept hill overlooking a creek, a half-built cabin, and a woman's face waiting for him. The image was so clear it hurt. "It's a deed," he said, his voice quiet, almost to himself, "to a piece of land up in Cheyenne, and a letter, a promise I made." He didn't need to say more. In the harsh calculus of the West, a piece of paper that meant a home was worth more than any gold bar. It was the only thing that mattered. It was a beginning, and men would kill for a beginning. It was the reason he had run so hard, and the reason he had finally stopped. You couldn't build a future on ground you were always running from. Matty was quiet for a long moment. She understood. Her own broken wagon was a testament to the same dream. "A promise is a heavy thing to carry," she finally said. The riders were 100 yards out now, close enough to see the hard set of their jaws. The man on the roan, Augustus, raised a hand, signaling them to a halt. The talking was about to start. "They'll try and circle," Matty stated, shifting the shotgun to her shoulder, its twin barrels looking like 2 dark eyes. "Draw our fire, then rush from the side." "I know," Money grunted. He felt a grim alignment with this woman, a partnership forged in dust and desperation. They were 2 sides of the same tarnished coin. Survivors. He sighted down the barrel of his rifle, centering the bead on Augustus's chest. The world narrowed to that single point. The flies, the heat, the thirst, it all faded away. There was only the target, the promise in the satchel, and the woman beside him. "Wait for my shot," he commanded. "The one on the far left is yours." Her only reply was the metallic click of the shotgun's hammers being pulled back. It was all the answer he needed. The silence stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Augustus's voice, when it came, was not a yell, but a casual, almost friendly sound that carried unnervingly across the baked earth. "William Money, figured you'd run out of ground sooner or later. You always did hate to sweat." He sat easy on the big roan, a silhouette of relaxed authority against the blinding sky. He didn't have his gun drawn. It was an insult, a show of absolute confidence. Money's finger tightened on the trigger, the metal hot against his skin. He held his breath, the beat of his sight unwavering on the man's chest. "It's over, Will," Augustus called out. "Just give us the satchel. No need for this to get ugly." "It's already ugly, Augustus," Money rasped, his voice a low growl. Augustus chuckled, a dry, sandy sound. "Always so dramatic." He shifted in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage. "And you've picked up a stray. Ma'am, this ain't your fight. Ride on out of here and we'll pretend we never saw you." Maddie didn't move a muscle. Her silence was its own answer. Augustus's smile faded. "Have it your way." Money's world contracted to the space between the rifle sight and the man on the horse. He let out half a breath and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was sharp and violent, ripping through the oppressive quiet. The bullet didn't strike Augustus but slammed into the silver horn of his saddle, sending a shard of metal spinning into the air. The big roan screamed and reared, nearly unseating its rider. In that same instant, the rider on the far left spurred his horse, breaking for the cover of a rocky outcrop to their flank. He never made it. A deafening roar erupted from beside Money as Maddie's shotgun bucked against her shoulder. The man was lifted from his saddle by the force of the blast, a clumsy puppet with cut strings, and crashed into the dust. His horse, panicked, galloped away into the shimmering heat. 3 left. The other 2 riders scrambled back, pulling their horses around and retreating to a safer distance. Augustus fought his roan back under control, his face no longer relaxed, but a mask of cold fury. For a moment, a sliver of hope cut through the haze. They had drawn first blood. They had made them hesitate, but the hope was a mirage, as false as a pool of water in the distance. Augustus didn't order another charge. He simply raised his hand again, and his 2 remaining men dismounted, rifles in hand, taking cover behind their horses. The fight wasn't over. It had just changed. "You always were a good shot, Will," Augustus yelled, his voice laced with a new, sharper edge. "But you never were very smart. You think this is about you? You think this is about some grudge?" He laughed, a bitter, angry sound this time. "That ain't just a deed to some dirt farm, you damned fool. That land you're holding, that's the Cimarron Gap, the only water source for 30 miles in any direction. More than that, it's the only way through the mountains the railroad surveyors could find. Our employer, Mr. Tuco, has already been paid a handsome sum for that right-of-way. He doesn't take kindly to having his arrangements disturbed." The words hit Money harder than any bullet. A farm, a home, a promise. It had all been a lie, built on a foundation of someone else's greed. This wasn't a personal vendetta he could somehow settle. This was business. Big, ruthless business that stretched all the way to the railroad barons and their endless coffers. These men wouldn't be scared off. They couldn't be. They weren't here for revenge. They were here to protect an investment, and their lives were cheap currency. The satchel in the dirt was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a death warrant. He glanced at Maddie. Her face was grim, her eyes fixed on the 2 riflemen who were now inching their way apart, looking for a crossfire. She understood. Her expression said it all. The world had just gotten a whole lot smaller, and a whole lot more dangerous. "We're not getting out of this," she said, her voice flat, stating a fact. She didn't look at him. She was reloading the shotgun, her movements economical and precise, her scraped knuckles white. "No," Money agreed. The last of his adrenaline drained away, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. He was no longer a man fighting for a dream. He was a man cornered, defending a lie he hadn't even known he was carrying. The weight of the promise he'd made to the woman waiting in Cheyenne felt impossibly heavy now, a stone that would drag him to the bottom of this dusty hell. Then Augustus did the last thing Money expected. He and his men didn't press the attack. Instead, they began to set up camp. One of them started gathering sparse creosote bushes, while the other unstrapped a coffee pot from his saddle. They were just out of reliable rifle range, 150 yards of heat-shimmering death separating them. They were calm, patient. Augustus strode to the edge of their makeshift camp, close enough that his voice could carry without a shout. "The sun is on our side, Will, and we've got all the water. That canteen of yours can't last forever. Your new friend's horse looks about done for, and I imagine she's feeling the thirst too. He gestured to the sky, where a dark shape circled lazily. Then another. Vultures. We'll wait, Augustus declared, his voice full of chilling certainty. You can cook in that little oven you've found. You can die of thirst, or you can try and make a run for it in the dark. We'll be listening. When you're ready to be sensible, just walk out with the satchel. Otherwise, we'll just pick it up off your corpses in the morning. With that, he turned his back and walked over to the small, sputtering fire his man had started. The smell of coffee began to drift on the hot breeze, a maddeningly domestic aroma in the midst of a death sentence. The easy out was gone. There would be no quick, decisive gunfight, no desperate charge to break through. There was only this, a siege, a waiting game where they held all the cards. Money looked at the single-dented canteen lying between him and Maddie. He felt the burning in his own throat, the grit on his tongue. He looked at the dead horse, already bloating in the heat, the swarm of flies a living shroud. He looked at Maddie, her jaw set like stone, the shotgun resting across her knees, no longer a weapon for a fight, but a tool for the inevitable. They were on their own, trapped in a crucible with the sun as their torturer and patient, methodical death waiting just beyond the range of their guns. The hope of escape had vanished, replaced by the grim mathematics of dwindling water and passing time. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in violent streaks of orange and purple. Long skeletal shadows stretched from the wagon and the rocks, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. The air began to cool, but it offered no relief. Thirst was a living thing inside them now, a rasping creature with claws. The scent of coffee from Augustus's camp was a distant, mocking memory. Money watched the firelight over at their camp flicker. He watched the two riflemen, now just dark shapes crouched behind their horses. They were patient. They knew the night belonged to them as much as the day had. They'll expect us to try something at dusk. Maddie's voice was a dry whisper, barely audible over the wind that had begun to stir the dust. It's the oldest trick in the book, which is why we're not waiting for full dark, Money said. He slid the rifle over the dead horse's flank. This is it, the in-between time, when the light plays tricks on a man's eyes. He looked at her. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom, her eyes dark pits of resolve. She had taken the last of the water an hour ago, a single, deliberate swallow, and had not spoken of it since. That bay horse of yours, he began. Can it run? It can move, she corrected. Running might be too much to ask. Moving is all I need. Money laid out the plan, his words clipped and precise. It was a desperate, foolhardy thing, a plan born of no other options. It had more ways to fail than to succeed, and they both knew it. Maddie listened without interruption, her head tilted slightly, her gaze fixed on the enemy camp. When he was finished, she simply nodded. Give me a count of 30 after your first shot, she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded back. He pushed the leather satchel toward her. You take this. Get to the rocks on the north side. The horse is your only way out if this goes south. She looked down at the satchel, then back at him. For the first time, a flicker of something, not softness, but a hard, bitter irony, crossed her face. And leave you here, Mr. Money. I've already lost one horse on this trip. I'm not keen on losing my only fighting partner, too. The satchel stays with you. They want you more than me. She pushed it back. She was right. The bag was a lodestone, drawing death toward whoever held it. He accepted it without another word. The promise was his to carry. So was the curse. He settled into position, the world shrinking to the narrow view over his rifle sights. He took a slow, steadying breath, the air burning his lungs. He found the silhouette of the rifleman on the right, a dark shape against the dying sky. He let the breath out. Now, he whispered to himself. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the shot deafening in the twilight stillness. The shape of the man crumpled without a sound. Before the echo had faded, Money was working the lever action, chambering another round. He shifted his aim to the second rifleman. 1, 2, 3. A muzzle flash answered from the enemy camp. A bullet whined past Money's ear and smashed into the wagon wheel with a sound like a hammer hitting stone. Splinters flew. 10, 11. He saw Maddie, a blur of motion in the deepening shadows. She wasn't running for the rocks. She was running toward the hidden bay, her shotgun held low. 15, 16. The second rifleman fired, the shot going wide. He was panicked, shooting at Money's muzzle flash. Money held his fire, letting the man waste a shot. Augustus was shouting orders, his voice sharp with fury. 22. 23. Suddenly, a third rifle shot cracked from an entirely new direction, from the rocky outcrop to their left flank. The shot was close. Too close. It ripped through the canvas above Money's head. A trap. Augustus had anticipated them. He'd moved a man during the day, laid an ambush for the very move they were now making. Matty froze in the open, caught between Augustus's camp and the hidden rifleman. A perfect crossfire. "Matty, get down!" Money yelled, his voice raw, but she didn't get down. In that split second of lethal hesitation, she did something insane. She raised the shotgun and fired both barrels not at a man, but at the ground right in front of the bay horse. The roar of the gun and the spray of dirt and rock sent the terrified animal bolting, not away into the darkness, but directly toward Augustus's camp, a frantic, riderless decoy. For a heartbeat, all three remaining men, Augustus, his camp rifleman, and the flanker, turned their attention to the stampeding horse, a primal reaction to the sudden, chaotic movement. It was the only opening they would get. Money swiveled, ignoring the two men in the camp, and fired at the muzzle flash from the rocks. He heard a cry of pain, a rifle clattering on stone. One less gun. He turned back just as Augustus, realizing his mistake, leveled his pistol at Matty. She was a stationary target, exposed and defenseless as she struggled to reload her shotgun. There was no time to aim, no time to get a clean shot. Money did the one thing they would never expect. With a guttural roar, he scrambled up from behind the dead horse, grabbed the leather satchel, and hurled it with all his might into the open space between them. "Take it, you son of a bitch!" he screamed. The bag sailed through the air in a clumsy arc, landing in the dust 20 feet from Augustus. The deed, the right of way, the entire reason for this bloody siege. Augustus's eyes, and the eyes of his last man, snapped to it. Greed was a more powerful instinct than murder. In that moment of pure, avaricious distraction, they forgot Matty. They forgot Money. Matty didn't. The shotgun in her hands came up. The action finally closed. The weapon boomed, a deep-throated roar that echoed across the flat. The last of Augustus's riflemen staggered back, his chest a ruin, and collapsed beside the fire. Augustus stared at his fallen man, his face a mask of disbelief. He spun back toward Money, his pistol coming up, rage and betrayal burning in his eyes. Money's rifle cracked one last time. The shot was true. Augustus stumbled backward, a dark stain blossoming on his white shirt. He looked down at his chest, then up at Money, his expression not of pain, but of utter surprise. He fell to his knees, his pistol dropping into the dust, and then pitched forward, silent and still. Silence descended, a profound, ringing quiet, broken only by the whimpering of the wind and the frantic, ragged sound of Money's own breathing. The smell of gunpowder was thick and acrid. He stared at the bodies illuminated by the flickering firelight, at the satchel lying forgotten in the dirt. He lowered the rifle, its barrel scorching hot. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the sheer, violent effort of it all. He looked over at Matty. She stood motionless, the shotgun held loosely at her side, smoke curling from its barrels. Her face was unreadable in the gloom. They had done it. They were alive. But it wasn't a victory. It was just the end of the killing. Around them, the desert was vast and empty, and the silence it offered was not one of peace, but of utter, absolute loneliness. The last echo of gunfire faded into the vast, indifferent quiet of the desert. For a long moment, neither of them moved. William Money stood with the rifle hanging from his hand, a dead weight. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed from the tension of the fight. Across the small dark space, Matty Ross remained a statue, the shotgun still pointed toward the ground. The flickering light from Augustus's campfire cast their shadows long and distorted, dancing grotesquely with the still forms of the dead men. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Money walked forward. He didn't look at Augustus, crumpled near the fire. He walked past him, his boots crunching softly in the dust, and picked up the leather satchel. He held it in his hand, the worn leather feeling alien now, its weight changed. It was no longer a promise. It was evidence. He turned to Matty. Her face, smudged with gunpowder and grime, was impassive. He couldn't read her eyes in the gloom, but he felt their weight on him. "You all right?" he asked. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. She gave a single jerky nod. She finally broke the stock of her shotgun, ejecting the spent shells. They fell to the dirt with two soft clicks. The simple mechanical action seemed to pull them both back into the world of the living. Thirsty, she said. Her voice was a dry leaf skittering across stone. Money nodded. The first priority. Survival. They had water. Together they moved with the leaden efficiency of the utterly exhausted. It wasn't a victory celebration, it was a salvage operation. Maddie went straight for the canteen slung from the dead men's saddles, checking each one, her movements methodical. Money walked over to the man he'd shot from the rocks. The rifleman was young, his eyes wide open to the star-dusted sky. Money felt nothing. He took the man's gun belt and rifle, then rifled through his pockets, finding nothing but a few coins and a half-eaten plug of tobacco. He returned to the fire. Maddie had lined up 4 canteens by the wagon wheel. She uncorked one and handed it to him. He drank deeply, the water tasting of canvas and life itself. It didn't quench the thirst so much as beat it back for a while. He watched her drink next, her throat working. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, leaving a clean streak across the grime. For a time they worked in silence, gathering what they could. Ammunition, a bag of dried jerky, a sack of coffee beans. Money found Augustus's saddlebags lying near the fire. He emptied them onto a dusty blanket. Along with personal effects, a folded map fell out, along with a thin sheaf of telegrams held together by a string. He picked up the map. It was professionally drawn, marking terrain features, waterholes, and survey lines. The words Cimarron Gap were printed neatly over the piece of land described in his deed. Red ink marked a bold line straight through it, labeled Proposed AT and SF Rail Line. The telegrams confirmed it. Crisp, business-like messages from a man named Tuco in El Paso, referencing survey payments, right-of-way acquisitions, and deadlines. One message was stark. Gap must be secured. No delays, no witnesses. Money stared at the papers under the flickering firelight. The truth was colder and harder than any bullet. He had been a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. He hadn't been running from simple claim jumpers. He'd been running from the future itself, from the iron progress of the railroad. He looked at the bodies. This wasn't the end of it, he said, his voice quiet. Maddie looked up from strapping a full canteen to her own belt. No, it's the beginning. He knew she was right. Tuco, this man of telegrams and maps, would not see the loss of 4 men as a defeat. He would see it as a cost of business, an inconvenience. He would send more men. 10 men, 20, an army, if he had to. They couldn't fight an army. They couldn't run forever either. The desert was big, but the railroad's reach was bigger. He felt the old despair creeping back in, the familiar feeling of being caught in a trap with no way out. He could tear up the deed, throw the satchel into the fire, and ride away. But Tuco didn't know that. He would assume the man who killed 4 of his enforcers was a threat to be eliminated. The message was clear. No witnesses. They were witnesses. Their very existence was a loose end. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm. Violence had gotten them through the night, but it would get them killed tomorrow. He looked at the telegrams again, at the map, at the satchel. He thought of Tuco in his office in El Paso, a man who fought with ink and money, not guns, a man who dealt in arrangements and acquisitions. And then an idea began to form, not a hope, but a path. A narrow, dangerous path through the heart of the problem itself. You can't scare a man like Tuco, Money said, thinking aloud. And you can't outshoot his money. He's not a gunslinger. He's a businessman. Maddie watched him, her expression sharp and focused. And what do businessmen fear? They fear messes, Money answered, the plan crystallizing in his mind. They fear delays. They fear losing a deal. This railroad, it's a big deal, worth a fortune. But deals like this, they're fragile. They're built on quiet handshakes and political favors. They don't like sunlight. He tapped the deed in the satchel. This paper isn't a claim to a farm. It's a problem for him. It proves someone else had a legal claim to that land before he did. It's a rock in the gears of his machine. He looked up at Maddie, his eyes holding hers in the firelight. We can't run. We can't fight. So we do the one thing he won't expect. What's that? She asked, her voice low. We sell him his problem back, Money said. We go to El Paso. We walk right into his office. Not to threaten him with a gun. We threaten him with this. He held up the satchel. We threaten him with a scandal. We tell him we'll take this deed and these telegrams to every competing railroad, to every newspaper, to every federal marshal between here and Kansas City. We'll create a mess so big and so loud it'll spook his investors and tie up his precious rail line in court for a decade. It was a breathtaking gamble, walking into the den of the wolf not to fight it, but to bargain with it. Maddie was silent for a long time. She looked from the bodies to the map, then to the satchel in Money's hand. She was weighing the odds, her mind as sharp and calculating as any gambler's. He could just kill us in his office, she stated, not as a protest, but as a variable in the equation. He could, Money admitted, but businessmen don't like killing in their own offices. It's messy. It draws attention, and it won't solve his problem if he doesn't know what we've done with the proof. He picked up one of the telegrams. We make a copy of this. We leave it with a lawyer, a banker, someone trustworthy, with instructions to release it if we don't return. Insurance. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed Maddie's face. She saw the shape of it now. It was no longer a desperate flight or a bloody siege. It was a business negotiation, and the currency was their lives. The horse, she said, her mind already working on logistics. My bay won't make it to El Paso, but they have 4. We'll take the 2 best ones. And their water. And their food, Money added. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. It was colder than that. It was purpose. He was no longer a man being chased by his fate. He was walking toward it, on his own terms. The promise he'd made to the woman in Cheyenne, the one for a home and a quiet life, was dead. He accepted that now. The new promise was simpler and starker. To live. It has to be you who walks in there, Maddie said, her gaze steady. He knows your name. He thinks of you as a dumb drifter he can push around. Let him keep thinking it. He won't see the play until it's too late. He nodded. You stay clear. You'll be the insurance. You hold the copies. If I don't walk out in 1 hour, you go to the marshal. All right, she agreed. There was no argument. They were partners in this. The unspoken trust between them had been forged in gunpowder and cemented by this shared, desperate strategy. They spent the next hour preparing. They saddled Augustus's big roan and another sturdy-looking buckskin. They packed the supplies, leaving the broken wagon and the dead men to the vultures and the sun. Before they left, Money took the deed and one of Tuco's telegrams. Using a piece of charcoal from the fire in the back of the map, he painstakingly copied the telegram's text. It was a crude copy, but it was legible. He folded it carefully and handed it to Maddie. Find a post office first thing, he instructed. Mail it to your brother in Santa Fe, or anyone. Just get it out of your hands. She took the paper and tucked it safely inside her shirt. Let's ride. This place feels like a tomb. They mounted up and turned the horses south toward El Paso. They didn't look back. The fire was dying, and the desert was reclaiming the small circle of violence. As they rode, the rhythm of the horses' hooves was steady and deliberate. It was no longer the frantic beat of a chase, but the measured pace of an approaching reckoning. William Money rode with his back straight, the satchel resting on the pommel of his saddle. He had been a farmer, a fugitive, a killer. Now, he was something else. He was a man with leverage, and in the West, that was the only kind of power that truly mattered. They rode south for hours, a 2-person funeral procession moving under a canopy of cold, brilliant stars. The desert at night was a different beast, hushed, vast, and alive with unseen things. The rhythmic clopping of 4 hooves on hard-packed earth was the only sound that belonged to them, a steady metronomic beat measuring the distance from the violence they'd left behind. Money rode with the tension still coiled in his shoulders, but the frantic edge of fear was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness that felt older than the mountains on the horizon. He glanced over at Maddie. She rode slumped slightly in the saddle, but her head was up, her gaze sweeping the darkness with a vigilance that never seemed to rest. They hadn't spoken since leaving the smoldering campfire. There was nothing to say that the shared trauma hadn't already communicated. They were bound now, not by friendship, but by the blood they had shed and the blood they had seen. An hour before what he guessed was midnight, he reined in his horse near a small cluster of shale and rock that offered a meager windbreak. "We'll rest the horses," he said. His voice sounded loud in the immense quiet. She slid from the buckskin without a word, her movements stiff. While she loosened the cinches and let the horses drink sparingly from a canvas bucket, Money gathered a few dry, skeletal sticks of greasewood. He built a tiny, smokeless fire in a hollow between 2 rocks, a small flicker of defiant warmth against the encroaching cold. They sat on opposite sides of the flame, the satchel on the ground between them. Maddie pulled a strip of jerky from a pack and chewed on it with slow determination. Money poured grounds into the coffee pot with water from one of the captured canteens and set it on a flat rock near the heat. The silence returned, thicker this time, filled with the things they weren't saying. Finally, Maddie looked up, her face illuminated by the low firelight. The hardness in her expression had softened, not into vulnerability, but into a stark clarity. "That letter you mentioned," she said. Her voice was even. "The promise. To the woman in Cheyenne." Money stopped staring into the fire. He didn't look at her, but he knew she was watching him, waiting. The question hung in the air, simple and direct, yet it carried the weight of his entire world. The life he'd been running toward was a mirage. The promise was built on sand. Slowly, deliberately, he reached inside his dusty coat and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained envelope. His fingers, clumsy with cold and fatigue, unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet, filled with a woman's neat, hopeful script. He didn't read the words. He knew them by heart. Words about a creek and a porch facing the sunset, and a life away from all this. A life that had never been his to claim. For a long moment, he just held it, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. It was the last remnant of a different William Money, a man who believed in second chances. He looked from the letter to the satchel, then to Maddie's unwavering gaze. He saw the truth laid bare in the firelight. The promise wasn't a key to a future, it was a chain to a ghost. With a quiet finality that felt like a prayer and a curse, he leaned forward and laid the letter on the edge of the flames. The paper browned at the edges, then curled, the black ink of the hopeful words bubbling before being consumed by the orange light. He watched until it was nothing but a fragile black ash that dissolved into smoke and drifted up into the infinite star-filled darkness. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding since he first stole the satchel. The heavy weight in his chest eased, not disappearing, but settling into something he could carry. "There's no woman," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Not anymore. Maybe there never was. Just a story I told myself so I could keep running." He finally looked at her, his eyes clear of the haunted look she'd first seen. "Back at the wagon, when I gave you the satchel, I wasn't trying to save you. I figured I was dead anyway. I was just trying to save the idea, the land, the promise." He gestured with his chin toward the place where the letter had burned. "But that idea is gone. It was a lie from the start. What happened back there, killing them, that was real. You, me, that was real." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the firelight carving deep lines into his face. "When you fired at the horse, Maddie, you didn't run, you didn't hide. You made a choice. In that moment, you weren't a stray I'd picked up. You were a partner. The only one I've had in a long time who didn't cut and run when things got hard." He fell silent, letting the meaning of his words settle between them. He was laying his cards on the table, not as a strategist, but as a man. "This trip to El Paso," he continued, his voice softer. "This play against Tuco, it ain't about a deed anymore. Not for me. Whatever we walk away with from this, if we walk away, half of it is yours. Not as payment, as a share. We started this together. We'll finish it the same way." He had offered her a business proposition, but it was something far more profound. It was a new promise. One made not to a ghost in a fantasy, but to the living, breathing woman of grit and gunpowder sitting across from him. He was choosing this path, this fight, with her. Maddie watched him, her expression unreadable. She picked up a small stick and poked at the fire, her mind clearly working. She wasn't weighing the money. She was weighing the man. She was weighing the promise. The West was full of broken men who made broken promises. After a long silence, she tossed the stick into the flames. She looked at the satchel, then at him. "A 50% share in a bullet to the head is still a bullet to the head, Money," she said, a hint of dry, mirthless humor in her tone. It was the closest she could come to acknowledging the absurdity and the gravity of their situation. She stood up and poured the now brewing coffee into 2 tin cups. She handed one to him. "But it's a better deal than 100% of nothing," she finished. She sat back down, cradling the warm cup in her hands. "All right, Money, we're partners." That was it. No handshake, no grand declaration, just a simple statement of fact, as solid and real as the rock they were sitting on. It was an acceptance of the terms and of the trust that came with them. For the first time, Money felt the crushing loneliness of his long run begin to recede. He was no longer just a man fighting for himself. They were a unit, a company of two against an empire of greed. He drank the bitter black coffee. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. When they finished, Maddie stood and picked up her rifle. "Get some sleep, Money," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she always possessed. "I'll take the first watch." He looked up at her, silhouetted against the stars, a steadfast and formidable ally. He wanted to argue, to insist on taking the first watch himself, but he stopped. He saw the offer for what it was, the first official act of their partnership. It was an act of trust. She was telling him to rest, to lower his guard, because she would hold the line. He simply nodded. He rolled himself in his dusty blanket, using his saddle as a pillow, and closed his eyes. The ground was hard, the air was cold, but for the first time in a very long time, as the sound of Maddie's quiet footsteps paced the perimeter of their small camp, William Money felt safe enough to sleep. 5 years had passed. The Cimarron Gap was no longer a name on a railroad man's map, a stretch of God-forsaken dirt to be conquered and paved over with iron. It was a place. It had a sound, the rhythmic ring of a blacksmith's hammer from a stone forge, the murmur of water flowing through irrigation ditches that fed fields of stubborn corn, the distant laughter of children chasing a runaway dog. It had a smell of fresh-cut pine from the half-finished schoolhouse, of baking bread from the communal oven, of damp, dark earth that had been turned and tended until it gave back life. William Money sat on the porch of the Ross and Money General Mercantile, his chair tipped back against the log wall. The frantic, hunted look that had been etched into his features was gone, smoothed away by time and purpose, leaving behind a quiet contentment that sat on him like a well-worn coat. His hands, resting on his knees, were no longer clenched around a rifle stock but lay open, the knuckles calloused from building, not fighting. He watched as a wagon, its canvas patched but its wheels sturdy, crested the rise at the eastern edge of the valley. Newcomers. There were always newcomers. The mercantile door creaked open behind him. Maddie Ross stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron tied around her waist. The years had barely touched her, save for a few fine lines around her eyes that spoke of long hours squinting at ledgers rather than enemies. She was the unyielding pillar around which this entire settlement, which the inhabitants had named Ross's Crossing, was built. She saw the wagon, and her gaze sharpened with the familiar, pragmatic assessment she applied to everything. "Another family from the looks of it," she stated, her tone practical. "That makes 3 this month. We'll need to open up the last of the seed stores before the first frost." "We'll manage," Money said, his voice a low, easy rumble. He didn't take his eyes off the approaching wagon. "Always do." Maddie stood beside his chair, her arms crossed. Her presence was a familiar comfort, a solid point in a world that had once been nothing but shifting sand. "Got a wire from the agent in Santa Fe," she said, her voice dropping slightly. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe finally broke ground on the southern route, through the Diablo Range. Word is, the blasting and grading is costing them a fortune. Tuco had to sell off 2 of his shipping firms to finance it. Money allowed himself a small, grim smile. He pictured Tuco in his fine office in El Paso, a man trapped not by guns, but by his own ambition. Their meeting had been short and silent. They had walked in not as vagrants, but as business partners with a single, non-negotiable asset for sale: silence. Tuco had looked at the deed, at the copies of his own telegrams, at the cold resolve in Money's eyes, and had understood the checkmate. He had paid them not to go away, but to become a ghost, a bad rumor he could deny. They had taken his money and the clean title to the Cimarron Gap, and in return they had vanished from his world, leaving him to his more expensive, less convenient future. "Good," Money said simply. It was all the epitaph their old war needed. The wagon rattled to a stop in the wide, dusty street before the mercantile. A man, his shoulders slumped with the weary posture of defeat, climbed down. A woman followed, clutching the hands of 2 small, hollow-eyed children. They looked at the neat log buildings, the green fields, the clear running creek, as if they were seeing a mirage. They looked like they had been run out of somewhere, their lives packed into a single wagon, their hope worn down to a nub. Money knew the look well. He'd worn it himself. He let his chair fall forward with a thud and stood up, his joints creaking. He walked down the porch steps toward them, his boots making soft sounds in the dust. Maddie watched from the porch, her expression unreadable but for the slight softening around her mouth. The man flinched as Money approached, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, where no gun hung. "Easy, friend," Money said, his voice calm. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Welcome to Ross's Crossing. You look like you've had a long ride." The man stared, bewildered. He had expected to be told to move on, to be warned off, to be treated as a threat. We heard there was land here," he stammered. "Work. We lost our place down by the Purgatoire. The railroad." He trailed off, the story a common and bitter one. "The railroad doesn't run through here," Money said. It was a statement of fact and a creed. "There's work. We're building a schoolhouse. And there's a plot of unclaimed land by the South Creek. Good water. Needs clearing, but the soil's rich." He pointed. "My partner, Miss Ross, runs the store. She can set you up with provisions. Pay it off when you can." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. The man just stared, his mouth slightly agape, unable to process a kindness so freely given. He looked from Money's calm face to the solid form of Maddie on the porch, then to the children who were already staring with fascination at the blacksmith's fire. "Why?" the man asked, the single word thick with suspicion and fragile hope. Money looked past him, his gaze falling on the gap itself, on the walls of rock that had once been his prison and were now the ramparts of his sanctuary. He thought of the promise he'd burned in the desert fire, a selfish dream of a private peace. What he'd built here with Maddie was something harder and infinitely more real. "Because this is a place for people who ran out of ground," Money said. "We've all been there." He turned and walked back to the porch, leaving the family to the quiet, efficient care of Maddie Ross. He resumed his seat, the late afternoon sun warm on his face. He watched as Maddie led the woman and children into the store, her voice low and practical, already discussing flour and salt pork. The man stood by his wagon for a long moment, his shoulders straightening as if a great weight had been lifted, before following them inside. Later, as the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in the same violent streaks of orange and purple he'd seen the night of the siege, Maddie came out and sat in the chair beside him. The town was quieting down. The clang of the hammer had ceased. The soft glow of kerosene lamps began to appear in windows. A profound peace settled over the valley. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the colors fade. It was a ritual they shared most evenings, a quiet accounting of another day won. "Heard you quoting yourself again, Money?" she said, her voice laced with that familiar dry wit. He grunted. "It was a good line. It's a good promise," she corrected softly. A young boy, one of the orphans from the family they'd taken in 2 years prior, came running out of the store with a piece of cornbread, shouting a cheerful, "Good night, Will. Good night, Miss Maddie," before chasing his friends down the street. Money watched him go, a real smile touching his lips. He looked out at the gap, now cloaked in deep blue shadow. It was the same land, the same sky, but he was a different man. The desperation of his flight across the alkali flat felt like a story about someone else. He had stopped running, not to make a final stand, but to finally start building. He hadn't found the solitary cabin from his false dream. He had found something better, a home, a legacy, written not in deeds and telegrams, but in the sturdy logs of the houses and the lives of the people who slept safely inside them. "That new family," Maddie said, her voice barely a whisper in the growing dark. "The little girl, she has your eyes." Money didn't answer. He just nodded, looking out at the sprawling, imperfect, and beautiful thing they had made from the ashes of a fight they were never supposed to win. Here, in the heart of the Cimarron Gap, they hadn't just survived, they had thrived, and in the quiet hum of the community settling in for the night, their true victory echoed, permanent and real. And so, the legend of Ross's Crossing was written, not in the dime novels sold back east, but in the foundations of the homes, the rows of corn, and the faces of the families who found shelter there. It serves as a stark reminder that the soul of the West wasn't forged only in the flash of a gunshot, but in the quiet, stubborn will of people to build something that lasts. William Money and Maddie Ross didn't just win a fight for a piece of land. They redeemed the very idea of a promise, creating a legacy of sanctuary from the ashes of their pasts. Their story is one of many we share here at Wild Old West Memories, tales of grit and grace on a lawless frontier. If you believe these are the legends that need to be told, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a journey into the past. Let us know in the comments what you think truly makes a Western hero. Until next time, pull up a chair, and thanks for listening.